All right, everybody, welcome back to Hour 2 of Researchers on a Mission. That's right, ROAM Radio. I am your host, Dr. J, and of course, co-hosting with me straight from London is Johnny Webb. I hope you all enjoyed the first hour with Eric von Däniken, and now we're going to be going in a different direction. We are speaking to filmmaker and host of Buzzsaw, Sean Stone. Sean, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure to speak to you. Obviously, we've always had questions to ask you. Last time I interviewed you, we ran out of time, and which normally happens when we have an amazing guest, an amazing conversation. And so I'm truly delighted. Although I know this time we have less time than next time, this is why we'll have to have you back on in the future. But specifically, the reason why we chose this date is because you will be speaking at the Conscious Life Expo in Los Angeles, February 6th through the 8th, which essentially is your first presentation at one of these large-scale events. And I guess we might as well back up before we go into what you're presenting there. I want to ask you, how did you get involved in this conspiracy field and the secrets, the occulted history that we have? And of course, I know through your father's films with JFK, you've always had an inside knowledge or knew that what's on the surface is false, but you took it one step further when you started hosting Buzzsaw. So what was it that brought you to that point?
No, I think I took it one step further when I directed my first feature film about, supernatural and paranormal activities that I had experienced, and then obviously Conspiracy Theory with Jesse Ventura preceded Buzzsaw. So I've definitely gone beyond the pale of, the respectable conspiracy community. But it's a long history, I guess. Ultimately, yes, boils back, like you mentioned, to JFK, my father's film, which I acted in as a little kid, playing Kevin Costner's son. And, even at 7 years old, JFK as a film fascinated me. I just remember watching it, all 3 plus hours, and, not really moving, just being transfixed. And I was, just absorbing all this information. And then, I think ultimately around 15, 16 in high school, I got much more interested by history, and, I did have certain access to questions that I, with my father, asking him, for his own insights, because you watch a film like JFK and you watch it over and over again, you start to realize, wow, there's a whole network of black operations and operatives and people converging for this one assassination, right? At so many different levels, whether it's intelligence, bankers, the financial Federal Reserve angle, the mafia angle, and then, if you're looking at, these different elements, webs coming together, it's actually where does it go? I mean, you start to study the history and you realize it's not just one event; it's a continuous relationship that the financial community has with the intelligence side, with the criminal side, or the criminal underworld, and there's this network that exists and has probably existed, going back to the dawn of empires, right? For control. And to control, manipulate our opinions and our perceptions, and to create kings and kill them when they stray from the policies. So when you start to get into that mentality, I think your whole perception of history changes. And then after I started getting to I wanted to study the historical, factual side. There were things that did crop up, I would say, around the Kennedy assassination. Some of the characters involved, like Guy Bannister, who was a former FBI man in charge of the X-Files, some of the X-Files departments for the FBI, and other synchronicities like this. So then you start to follow the UFO, the documented UFO sightings and whatnot, and the question of whether or not Kennedy was how in the know he was. There was apparently, I remember reading in one of the books on Marilyn, an FBI transcript saying that they had been monitoring obviously Marilyn's conversations with Kennedy, and that he had mentioned to her the alien presence on Earth. And, you start to follow that logic and start to realize, okay, so we not only do we have this whole shadow side of empire and power that's existed, going back to the days of Egypt and Babylon, but what if there's also an extraterrestrial, or what's extra-dimensional, some people call extra-dimensional presence here. And that's really when it gets even more mind-boggling and intriguing. So, I always laugh when people talk about conspiracies, and it's like, well, I can believe this conspiracy, but I can't believe the idea of aliens or demons or whatnot. And yet we have records of it going back, for thousands and thousands of years of these sort of, gods and what people called gods or demons and, beings or whatnot, right? They have different names and in all cultures across time. So why don't we give any credence or perhaps, contemplate the reality of that phenomenon? So I think, my interest basically just keeps evolving, I would say, as a human being, in given the fact that we're born into a planet. We don't really know how we got here, even in our own existence, right? You have to ask that question. What am I doing here? Who am I? What's my purpose? And I think the more you get into those kind of questions, the mysteries do start to open up for you, and you can pursue them if you so choose, or you can just shut down and be a closed-minded, very or ordinary person if you so choose. But I find that pretty boring.
I would have to second that motion. If you just sit there and let those conspiracies go by and you don't look down the rabbit hole and open up your mind to what's actually out there, you're right. You're just considered a sheeple, and you're never going to wake up to the true reality. And one thing I really liked what you said is, how can some people believe in one set of conspiracies yet say, well, this is too outlandish? But the problem is as you mentioned, once you go down the rabbit hole, you'll see all these interconnections. And especially, as you mentioned, in our history, whether it be the Bible or the other holy books of other religions, there's always a reference to angels coming from the heavens above, or gods, or leprechauns, or demons, or whatever it may be. And I think they truly are all connected. Now, you mentioned age 7, you were in JFK. As a matter of fact, it's ironic you said you acted in it, because I didn't know that until recently when I saw you were Kevin Costner's son, as well as Natural Born Killers. You played Mallory Knox's brother. But with that being said, what was your turning point? Did you already assume from age 7 that the world is not what it seems, or was there something further that came in your adult life that made you go even further down the rabbit hole?
I mean, like, when you're 7 years old, I don't think you even understand what that means. What is the world? You're not really, concerning yourself too much with, the printing of money, or even dealing with money per se. I was very much into my, childhood at that point. I didn't have to, thankfully, have to concern myself with, working at like a very young age, or, worrying about where I was going to get my next meal from. So there was no need at that point to even be cognizant, let's say, of the world beyond, your childhood friends and school, and basically, the basic existence, right? I definitely understood that there's a lot more to movie making than people ever realize, and it's really interesting when you see these cults of celebrity, especially as they've evolved so, I'd say, to such beyond the pale, in a sense, to the point where we literally have celebrities being treated like kings and queens, right, and nobility of the old world in modern society, and the amount of attention, news topics being focused on, a celebrity's personal life, and how, when you really get it, it's all for pay. It's all like a show to make money off of. In a way, like the marriage, the nature of like marriages, right, between nobility, where you have a prince and princess would have an arranged marriage, right? Why? To increase profit, to gain access to certain treasuries, or to make alliances between kingdoms, right? The same thing happens in the world of celebrity. So when you understand that, you start to really just laugh at how much people are buying into the gossip, when I just look at it as, no, they're just trying to sell something. When two famous people get married, it's usually, to make an alliance between their empires, right? And that's, I think, one thing that I was able to understand, because I saw the reality of making a film and how much process and thought goes into it. And I think that's the real nature of media, which is so important, is that most people don't realize that whatever is put on the TV in front of you, whether it's news, whether it's a film, whether it's music, it's something that's been worked through and thought through. And, not necessarily endlessly when it comes to most news, because they don't have as much time as when you have a film or music or whatnot. But either way, it's something that has been intentionally thought about and put in front of you. And as a result, it's almost like you've had a little taste of seeing the wizards, behind the curtain in Oz. And as a result, you're not really as impressed by the demonstrations and shows that are put out for mass consumption, because you start to understand, no, it's a mind game. It's a psychological war that's really going on for people's minds. And it's a question of where their energy is going to go, which usually their energy is money, right? That's the key form of energy in our planet at this moment that we all think about, is money, as opposed to, there's also obviously the energy of powering our vehicles and our lifestyles. But then there's also, I believe, a spiritual energy, which is even more valuable. And the Eastern traditions talk about like a chi, right? Your breath, your vital energy as a being, and that's something that we've kind of, in the material realm, we've lost touch with, and we've lost track of, because we've been focused upon the money energy side of things.
That's a fact to me, because I think for thousands of years, people knew about their roots. They knew where we came from. Almost every known civilization talks about getting wisdom from the star people and all those other entities. And there's always a reference from a chariot from the sky, chariots on fire, or flaming shields, and you name it. It's all throughout history. But you're right. At some point, we lost that ability to connect with that spiritual side. And I don't think it's on accident, more so that it's on purpose. Like you said, from the propaganda and the news, for instance, fear is control, as you know. The more fear they put out, the more control they have over people. Now, you mentioned clean energy and other sources that we could use. And to me, what it seems is that we've always had an ability to use other sources, but the reason we keep going back to fossil fuels is because they can control it. They can control the money, and by doing that, not only are they getting richer, they're also making sure that we humans, as a populace throughout the whole globe, are in check. What do you think about the energy problems that we have around the world, and can it be fixed?
Of course. I mean, my mentality on all things on this planet is that we actually have infinite resources. The infinite resources, the creativity of the human mind, you see. And so, for, at one point in time, oil has no value whatsoever. Once you figure out how to work the internal combustion engine, now oil becomes very valuable, right? Everything is an application of technology insofar as our existence. So when we should have evolved, to a higher energy flux density, for example, beyond oil, being nuclear fission, and then really just a crash program towards thermonuclear fusion processes, right, which is probably the most safe and most powerful energy form that we could currently fathom. Not getting into the alternative, far out stuff like the Tesla-based technologies, the idea of, free energy and whatnot. I'm not going to go into that because I don't really understand it fully. But fusion, we know, has been on the table since the late 70s, and pretty feasible since that point. And as soon as it became somewhat feasible, it's as though we shut down the entire nuclear program. So when people talk about nuclear energy, they're talking about like 1970s power plants, and that fear of nuclear is based in the 70s as opposed to the modern era, which countries like South Africa and Canada and other countries are developing these new, they're not developing them, but they're building these new power plants, nuclear power plants predicated in recyclable energies like thorium, thorium-based nuclear as opposed to uranium and plutonium processes. So you have like a lot of, evolutions that I feel like we've not really caught on. But at the same time, look at our country. Our country has been deindustrialized. It's literally collapsed. And you look at go back to like the Vietnam War era. That's when they started to shut down all the peaceful, we'll call peacetime industries, and shift to an entirely military industrial complex. And that's what we've seen since Vietnam, since like 65, basically, right after Kennedy's death. Has been, you don't see any building of new, rail. For example, we could be building maglev rail with our Detroit power plants that have been, our Detroit car plants, that were shut down, the machine tool factories and whatnot that have been shut down in Detroit and places like that. They could have converted that and started building maglev high-speed rail across this country. Why not? We were the first ones to develop that, that transcontinental rail from the East Coast to the West Coast, and yet we're not advancing with those type of initiatives, so we don't have to be trucking goods on highways with these, and causing congestion and destroying the road structure with the trucks. They keep putting them on rail. But the point being that there's been no initiative towards the peacetime industries. It's all been an initiative towards military-industrial wartime business since Vietnam. And that's why, we've pretty much been in this kind of rut, I think, as a country where we may have had some economic growth, at certain periods, in the 80s and 90s or whatnot. But it's usually a monetary growth as opposed to which basically benefits the Wall Street upper echelon, let's say. People invested in Wall Street, whatnot. But you oftentimes at the expense of the peacetime industries, right? And the blue collar workers, for example, in the cities that have been destroyed in Middle America, where literally the populations have collapsed. You get cities like Detroit that are just in bankruptcy, and there's no need for that. We should have physical economy, because that's really where, if you talk about what it is to exist, you need, you have to have agriculture. You have to be able to produce, healthy food, organic foods. You have to be able to have infrastructure to connect to your markets, from the production to markets, for example. And, all these things require energy, obviously. So this would be how we could have developed as a country, and we could be booming economically right now. We could be able to absorb the new immigrant populations. But instead, we're in more of a collapse mode that, gets masqueraded because of the value of the dollar. But this is also a lot of trickery because of the fact that everyone is forced to utilize the dollar. So every transaction with oil is predicated on using the dollar to buy oil. So everywhere in the world, every country in the world has to purchase dollars if they want oil, right? So that's the trick of it, how the dollar basically maintains its strength. And I think it's very much a fiction. If it was, if we were just any other country, if we didn't have the military presence around the world, if we didn't have the monopoly over purchasing of oil through the dollar, we would have collapsed by now, I think.
One thing that I always confused or angered about is 150 years ago when we started using cars for the first time, before Ford built the Model T, we were using steam engine cars, and then, of course,
I was going to mention that too. Yeah, so go ahead.
Then the internal combustion engine. Why, with all these amazing technologies that we've developed over the last 150 years, are we still using technology going back to 150 years ago? And it goes back even further than that, because if you think about the Chinese rockets that they were launching 1,000+ years ago, it's the same idea. Burning chemicals for propulsion.
Yeah. Well, I mean, also like the windmill, for example, the idea of the environmentalists want to go back to the windmill. It's like, come on, this is 16th, 17th century's technology. Let's evolve. The problem is you have an elite mentality that believes that there's too many humans on the planet. They want to wipe out half to 2/3 of the world's population. They don't want people to advance scientifically to have access to knowledge. It's just an elitist, way of thinking. And it does, I think, boil down to control and money. Because look, when you create conflict, right? When you create tension, people, those states that are in a state of war or in a state of tension are dependent upon the higher power, right? For access to weapons, for access to foods, you name it, currency. I mean, the point is that you're in a state of dependency when you're in a wartime state. Right, you're not self-sufficient, and the big policy. I mean, this is what I studied at Princeton in my New World Order thesis, was the policy of the British Empire at the end of the 19th century, late 1800s, going into the early 20th century, was they knew the empire was collapsing because they could not keep a military presence in a quarter of the world. That's how much Britain had. I mean, England ruled a quarter of the planet, landmass-wise, right? And, how much are we talking about just landmass, talking about natural resources? I mean, it's a tremendous amount of power. And they said, look, we don't have the personnel to do it. We can't. We lost the Boer War, in a sense, because we just couldn't sustain a conflict here. And this is just one country. This is South Africa we're talking about. And what happens if war breaks out all over the empire? We need to be less stringent. We have to be more informal in our control. We have to educate the leaders of the countries that are part of the British Empire, right? We have to bring America back into our fold. We have to bring America back into the imperialist mentality of Britain. America right now wants to be a revolutionary free country, right? No, we have to bring them back into our mindset. And so what the British Empire did was to basically take all these elites and bring them over for Rhodes scholarships at Oxford, and basically train them in the imperial mindset. And that's how everything shifted, really, away from the idea of nation states being self-sufficient, being able to have a fair trade basis, because technology, it permeates across borders. There's no reason why African countries can't be refining their own natural resources. It makes no sense that Africa has to export, its resources abroad, or like export its diamonds abroad to be refined, right? Why is that?
You're right. That boggles my mind. Why are the African nations shipping their oil here for us to refine it, for us to ship it back?
Well, Saudi Arabia, for example, the whole nature, again, if you look at like Saudi Arabia, right, how much the Saudi family was put in power by the British in the first place. That was a British imperial move to put the Wahhabist Saudis into power. They had no power in Mecca. I mean, in terms of the actual control of the country, I can't remember exactly, but they basically had a small region of the country. The British were the ones that put them there in charge. And, the rulers that should have been in Arabia were put in the thrones of Jordan and Iraq, right, and other countries. I think Syria as well. Syria, I think, at one point had a king, too. So you see, it's like, it's all these manipulations that are taking place that are creating, basically, it's like, putting tribe against tribe, or pitting family against family. And meanwhile, you sell them, and you basically control them through your currency, and you make sure that they never able to be self-sufficient enough that they could ultimately oppose you. For example, when the Shah of Iran, started pursuing a more self-sufficient policy in the 70s, and he basically was tampering with oil prices. He was threatening to develop the nuclear program, because that's where the Iranian nuclear program dates back to the 70s, because the Shah was the one building the power plants. He said, look, we don't want to be on oil, we want to be on nuclear. And at that point, it was like, no way are you guys going to be self-sufficient when it comes to energy. So that's basically when he got ousted. And I think it was a lot of shenanigans. I don't think it was organic that Khomeini came to power that rapidly and with such a cohesive force. I mean, it's kind of, look at the Russian Revolution as well. There's a lot of Wall Street financing involved in that revolution. So the point being that these things don't happen by chance. It really is about, at the end of the day, I think it's about a lot of financial dealings that take place, and whether or not we entirely understand the situation or not, we have to understand that there's money that's ultimately flowing back to the people in power across this planet. And who they ultimately are, if we call them the Illuminati, if they're actually bloodlines, families, that's really the big question, right? Is how old are these rulers? Do they go back to Babylon and Egypt? I'm not necessarily convinced of that, but I do feel like there is this kind of dynastic quality of some of these families that they date their wealth and their crest back to like the 1200s and before. So it's pretty old if you think about the lineage.
And this is exactly why they marry amongst each other and always marry another royal family, so they can keep those same bloodlines. As a matter of fact, there was a great little YouTube split that I watched a few years back, where essentially it was talking about the Bushes related to Queen Elizabeth, and even when George W. Bush ran against Kerry, they were distantly related, through marriage as third cousins or something along the lines of that. So it always comes down to those elite having the same bloodline. Now I want to go back to something. Two things. I'm going to go back a few minutes, and then I'm going to come back to something more recent you said. The Honorable Paul Hellyer, former Defense Minister of Canada, graces us with his joining these airwaves fairly often. And one of the things he said last time, he said during World War II, all the places that were able to create cars, manufacture cars or clothing or anything, was switched during the war effort to help the military. Why can't we take the defense contractors, such as the people who manufacture tanks and other things for our military, and start using them for humanitarian purposes? And it all comes down to what basically you said: money, debt, elasticity, and control. Would you agree?
Yeah. I mean, again, it's you said it earlier when you said the fear mongering that goes on. I mean, you watch these movies like the American Snipers, getting 200 million people to watch it, and it plays into the reptilian brain. I mean, that's the fundamental problem, is that we have a population, especially in the West. I mean, I don't know if it's probably permeating worldwide now with the materialist culture, but the reptilian brain that's very reactive in its thinking. It's fight or flight. It's fear based, and it's like it's the root of this kind of like this desire to for bloodlust. And so you get a movie like American Sniper getting $200 million at the box office or whatever the heck it is, and it's like there's no actual purpose to me to this movie. It's kind of a sickening thing to watch, but just like Fox News is sickening, and yet it stimulates people in the sense of, yeah, let's I'm angry, I hate that guy, I want to kill him, I want revenge, let's go get him. And that part of our brain is being fed constantly by, especially by the mainstream news, by a lot of the films that are being put out. You name it. It's like the nature of our reality right now is not predicated on any kind of morality. There is no basis of morality. We've lost the spiritual side of things. We've lost the reflective aspect of being able to see a situation and think about the cause that predicated it. Right? It's like what causes this? All we see now are moments of violence in the world, right? And rather than thinking and reflecting upon it, our reaction is very simple. Oh, there's violence. Got to blame somebody. Got to go start kicking ass, right?
Yes.
It's just so repetitive and redundant. Yet the fact that it continues to work to manipulate the human brain that way and to manipulate the human response, it's so programmatic. It's like Pavlov's dog. I mean, I think the film Boyhood kind of caught that message, but people didn't really get it. But when they talk about Pavlov and this reactive brain and how social media is catering to that reactive aspect of us, where every time we hear an instant message or an email coming in or a phone call, it's like our brain it releases certain certain chemicals that make us really respond happily. Right? We're all happy by the nature of social media, as far as we feel more liked, we feel more of our ego feels flattered, right, by the attention that social media allows to each of us. And as the ego, basically our ego is being swelled by the nature of social media and the fact of, I can watch whatever appeals to me, I can just be more in my own world, in my own bubble. We're simultaneously losing this empathy that's necessary, this interest in the thoughts of the deeper thoughts of someone else, let's say the deeper feelings of someone else. It's like it becomes more self-oriented, less other-oriented. So I think there's like a very slippery slope we're on right now, where we can use social media to talk about issues and to kind of hopefully create, utilize the Facebook and utilize these tools to create empathy and understanding between peoples across cultures and across, borders, you name it, ethnic groups, religions. That's the positive side. But the negative side is the fact that we are being more and more catered to the me generation, the iPhone, right? And the ego is being stimulated. And that aspect of ourselves, obviously, is where this fear-based programming is most effective.
And it's causing us problems. I want to actually come back and I want to comment on those things, but I do have a question that just came in via chat. It says, ask Sean if he had seen My Pet Goat 2 and what did Sean make of it?
I think, was there ever a Pet Goat 1? I can't remember. Or was it just always Pet Goat 2?
I've never seen one. I've never seen part 1.
Okay. So I was just curious because I couldn't recall if there ever was a part 1. Yes, I saw the video, and I think symbolically it was very masterful, the way that it was done. Ideally, it gets people to start to think about the nature of synchronicity, which is really a true language of the universe, to think symbolically, and start looking at events, films, TV programs, start to see that what is behind it, like what is coming through here, what is, use your intuition, use your psychic sense, and that's something that has to be activated if we're going to survive, is to start realizing, utilizing that which is in our innate nature to, basically, going back to the origin of mankind, but it's like being able to go into that dream time, being able to go into the different parts of our brain as they activate and hopefully open up. Even it's been proven, for example, meditation, these kind of things help to expand your brain. But the point being that the more we can expand and be receptive, we can pick up on what the universe is showing us and telling us at all times, and how much this really is a subjective reality we're living in. There is no objectivity in this world. There's a subjectivity, and we need to trust that instinct and go with that intuition and follow it. So, what the media is broadcasting, whether it be via the presidency and the politics side of it, or the nature of wars, nature of of some kind of conflict somewhere, there's a lot of symbolism that has to do with I would almost call it like a ritual, like they're energetically feeding upon us. They're conjuring all kinds of things now, whether or not you believe in entities or demons or whatnot. We have to understand that psyche itself, the psyche of the mind itself, is littered with artifacts and visions and knowledge that even comes back from thousands of years ago, from past generations. We're starting to understand that more and more, that like our genetics, our DNA actually carries memory from our ancestors, right? And that they've had theories about this, how psychologically we can be affected by our ancestors' desires or fears, right? So the point being that I think we have to come to a place of more self-awareness, because by becoming self-aware, we essentially, we change the world around us. Going back to like the simple Gandhi saying, you have to be the change you want to see. So you become self-aware, you become more thoughtful, calmer, more peaceful. That's going to create a resonance with others who will start to resonate with you, basically. And you'll see the parasites and the people that are not on your level kind of fade away. And those who are on your level, ideally will work with you, and you'll start to be able to build things and construct. But again, it's all about where you are. I believe that when our society right now is so sick, and we're so, since we are responsible for our own fate, as much as we can blame the elite, we have to recognize our own need to attain to a higher level of consciousness and awareness, and stop tuning into the elite's, messaging of, from the news or from the mainstream, television or whatnot. If we stop tuning into that, I do think that's how we're going to start to transform the nature around us.
Yes, the propaganda and absolutely the subliminal messaging there make us do their bidding for them. Now, it's medically proven that we only use a small percentage of our brain. And like you mentioned, through techniques such as meditation and others that quieting the mind, that we can actually connect to our higher selves and maybe unlock some of these abilities that were lost. Dr. Roger Lear, before he passed away, the alien implant doctor, was telling me an amazing story about the Tower of Babel not being exactly literally the way it was, but essentially when the Bible says that everyone started speaking in tongues, what he interpreted that as being is that we're all capable of telepathy, we always were, but something happened where we lost that ability, and that was the first time that people had to use their mouths to communicate. What do you think of that theory? Do you think it's possible?
Yeah, I think it's actually a very valid theory. Because, if you take it biblically and you say that in the beginning was the Word, then people would say, okay, so language came before the Tower of Babel story, right? So that would negate the idea that telepathy is what existed before Babel. But again, word is simply vibration, right?
That's right.
It's frequency, and so it's basically trying to tell us that all existence first comes from although we see and perceive an existence, first comes from that which is invisible. All that we create first comes from the thought. And rather than believing that it's our brains that are creating thoughts, why don't we believe? Why can't we start to perhaps hypothesize? Let's go to the hypothesis of the higher hypothesis. What if there is universal broadcast that's taking place, right? There's that's creating these dimensions of existence, and there are certain vibrations of light, and then when it's vibrates at a different frequency, it becomes matter, right? Different, as we know, different densities of matter, right? That's why water, can be air, can be ice, right? But yet, how do you say? It all begins with the formless before it becomes form. So, if in the beginning was the Word, it probably did come from a place initially of telepathy. That's why we still have vestiges of it. That's why we can still have psychic abilities to a certain extent, right? We can have intuition about people when we meet them for the first time. We can signal to them without even. We know that we emit signals, right? A lot of the communication that exists is silent, nonverbal, right? So that's, I think, very much indicative of the fact, yes, that probably the primordial language probably was a psychic, telepathic existence. But then, it also begs all kinds of questions about what humans looked like in the beginning of Earth's existence. How we've changed physically speaking. How do you say? How many different species initially came here. I mean, there's so many questions when it comes to the beginning of planet Earth. I think you could make endless amounts of movies and TV shows just speculating upon, who was here at the beginning. And this is even we're talking like Atlantis seems ancient to us, but Atlantis is probably only 30, 40,000 years ago that it sank, right? That's that civilization. How many civilizations collapsed before it? So, you're talking about millions of years of Earth existence. We know exactly. Dinosaurs once roamed this planet, but there's also these weird inscriptions I've seen, on some in Latin America and Egypt both, I think, where they have depictions of dinosaur-looking creatures, right? Which is pretty cool because it makes you wonder, could it be possible that there were either humans here at that time? Perhaps did we not carbonate exactly correctly? Do we know exactly, do we know how accurate the carbonating was? And so maybe was there a human-like species here? Do we have time travelers of some sort? Is time travel possible? Especially, I think they found footsteps, human-like footsteps that are basically carbonated around the same time as more like called dragon, dinosaur-like creatures. But in a sense, too, are dragons dinosaurs? These legends of dragons, historically, are they, some kind of dinosaur? So I just feel like, if you talk about fantasy and whatnot, what's occurred on this planet in the billions of years of its existence, that's just up to your imagination and perhaps your memory, your psychic, perhaps past life memory, to try to piece that together.
Something you said a little while ago about when you were at Princeton, you wrote about the New World Order, which to me shows that you were already paying attention to the world events. And as you know, and most people know, that George H.W. Bush talked about there being a New World Order. I think it was 91 when he said it. When did you start paying attention to it? Because obviously if you wrote a paper on it in Princeton, you were thinking about it long before that. What precipitated that?
Well, actually, what you just said about the Bush comment, that was September 11th, 91, that he made the comment.
20 years to the day.
Yeah. No, 10 years.
Oh, that's right, 10.
Yeah, I mean, the New World Order thesis that I wrote sort of was, how do you say, it evolved over the course of a year. At the time, I guess I didn't really entirely know what that meant, the New World Order. I'd heard about it, but let's be honest. You have people as far, right, as Pat Robertson writing books about the New World Order, right? You got the John Birchers, and then you also have, the left wing who talks about it, sometimes in a positive sense, right? The idea of let's break down the global, let's break down the nation, the barriers of nation states. Let's allow for global commerce, and that seems to be the positive aspect of the New World Order, right? The globalization aspect. But not to say that. Let's be honest, we've always had globalization. We've always had trades, across from China to Europe, across Silk Roads. We have certain indications, right, of the Moors, Muslim Moors and Vikings being here in North America, right? Even before Columbus. And that's not even speaking of evidence of perhaps Phoenician travelers, Phoenician traders going, as far as the New World, perhaps before Christ. So I think globalization is kind of it's a false. It's not false, but it's a little bit of a put on that all of a sudden we've reached globalization because we now have airplanes. Whether or not we did have airplanes in the past and rockets, we do know that there's always been trade globally, right?
Yes.
So when it came to the New World Order thesis, I was looking into the mentor to Henry Kissinger, who was William Mandel Elliott, a professor of politics at Harvard for about 40 years, and he had trained, people like Kissinger, and he taught Kennedy, and he was much more of a mentor for people like Sam Huntington, the Bundy brothers, remember McGeorge, and who was his brother? William, I think. So he just had a lot of influence when it came to politicians, but he was also very friendly with some of the Rockefellers, and involved with a lot of those foundations. So that's when you start to look into the ties, and Eliot himself had been trained in England as a Rhodes Scholar. So I started reading. I think the best book to look at is Tragedy and Hope by Carroll Quigley, because here's a Georgetown professor who Clinton praised, at his funeral, had taught him. And Quigley basically started talking about the open conspiracy that was this financial elite who were mostly predicated out of the Anglo-American bloodlines, right? And believed in that idea of a English-speaking union between America and England, and believed in the British Empire being continued through America. And he just talks about this very, matter-of-factly. So that was kind of, I think, the best intro for the New World Order as far as, people to understand that the empires never die. They just take more informal names, right? Like the British Commonwealth sounds much better than the British Empire, right? So that was kind of like my beginning into this thesis. And there's obviously so many different understandings of what the New World Order ultimately means, but in a certain sense, it really begs the question: what was the old world order that they were trying to break from to create a new world order?
And maybe it was better than what we have now. Maybe they were closer to their consciousness. Maybe they were more aware. I don't know. You're absolutely right. That does beg a very important question. What was the old order? I'm going to go back to something you said about 15 minutes ago or so. You mentioned the reptilians. I remember seeing that episode of Conspiracy Theory, and it was basically you and Tyrell that had to convince Jesse Ventura that this is something worthy in looking into, because it was one of the top conspiracies. I think it was Time magazine that labeled it. What got you interested into the reptilians, and what's your current take on them?
I haven't seen one. Well, that's not true. I think probably on like a mushroom or ayahuasca, I've seen reptilians. But in this physical reality, have I seen reptilian? No. I have a lot of thoughts on them. Actually, I don't even know if it's the right time to really broadcast it. I just think that right now, let's just leave it at the fact that the reptilian brainstem is something that people should take into account. The fact that this reptilian mind and how it, this reactive part of ourself, this fear-based instinct, to flee or fight or to want to control and conquer and dominate, that's largely from the reptilian brain. And we push forward into the frontal lobes, into the mammalian brain, to more towards like to the mammalian sector, right, of the mind, and start activating that part, and recognize that we all share, like what Kennedy said, we all share this small planet. We all have the same desires for our children, and we ultimately do want peace as human beings. And yet there is this nefarious sector that I think it's like, probably 10% of the population. You talk about like 10% or less are sociopaths, right?
Yes.
And that kind of gives us an indication into what the reptilian mindset may be, being more of the one who can charm you but believes nothing of what they say. The one who basically smiles and is a villain, right? The one who seems to be the great benefactor and philanthropist, but really is just using the money for his own or her own advantage, and ultimately like his own control, using the money for control. Let's say using it to control others, as opposed to the idea of the American system of economics, the American basis of economics, which was the advantage of the other, the benefit of the other. The fact of, like talk about Henry Ford, like Fordism. Look, our employees, they are our consumers. Why would I not want my employee to have good wages? If they don't have good wages, they can't buy, my product and other people's products, right? Well, the best way to solve that problem was to issue credit like crazy and basically enslave people in debt, right? So that's why you could basically collapse people's real wages for the last 40 years, but meanwhile issue the credit cards and issue the mortgages and whatnot, right? Without them needing to ever pay it back. That was always the policy of the banker, right? It's like, I don't really care if you ever pay it back. I just want to make sure you always pay. You just pay your interest, right? And you keep making payments. That's all I care about.
The elasticity.
It's very different. The banker mentality is very different from the businessman who actually wants people to be able to to consume and live with a higher standard of living.
Definitely. The elasticity of the banking, I think it's a problem. Yes, it keeps them in business, but at the same time, it keeps the consumer who's borrowing the money in a position where they're never going to pay it back. We have a little over 10 minutes. The last half I want to spend on with the Conscious Life Expo, but for the next few minutes, I wanted to ask you, you've interviewed several people. You have your own documentary coming up. You host Buzzsaw, and of course you were on Conspiracy Theory. What are the top 5 conspiracies or people that you've come across that you think to be the most valid, and what you think the people out there listening should be the most afraid of?
The top 5 conspiracies?
Yeah.
Oh, man. Well, what are your top 5 conspiracies?
My top 5?
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. I think I would have to say the ET presence is number one. There's so much evidence, I think, that leads me to the direction that they're absolutely hiding something. Even recently, the NASA announcing that life does exist, even though they haven't found it. They're just guaranteed 100% sure it exists now. That was on January 18th, that announcement was made. That would be number one. Number 2, of course, is 9/11. If you notice, nobody talks about Building 7 anymore, and and all these engineers around the world saying that it's impossible for these 2 buildings to collapse. Number 3, I would definitely have to put. Exactly. Yeah, exactly. But nowadays, most people talk about towers 1 and 2. They don't really talk about towers, building 7, which if you hear the owner of that day who owned the insurance policy said we had to pull it in demolition terms, demolish it. You're telling me in a few hours period during a terrorist attack, you have time to survey a building, place demolitions, and demolish it in the chaos? It doesn't make sense.
Well, they never admitted that it was intentionally demolished.
Well, he did say,
no, I know on the day they said pull it, but I'm saying no one has ever admitted that the Building 7 was officially demolished. So the point being that's what they're saying is that it was collapsed by falling debris from the debris. Buildings 1 and 2.
And then, of course, JFK is another third one. And I can go on and on, but those, I would say, are the absolute top 3. And then if you want to go one step further, that we're all being controlled by the elite Bilderbergers, Illuminati, whatever you want to call them, cabal, according to Dr. Edgar Mitchell and Paul Hellyer. And regardless of what name you put at them, that's what they are. And then I would have to say those would be the top 4. Off the top, 5th one off the top of my head, the financial crisis. I don't think we have the money in the gold in Fort Knox that we say we do.
Right.
Which ones would you agree of those?
Oh, no, I think that's all good. That's all good. I think the greatest conspiracy is the trick that, A, we're nothing more than animals. Human animals on this planet, kind of, evolved from monkeys, just by some, magic leap of evolution, from monkey mind to man mind, right? So it's all just an accident, that we're here by accident, basically, on this little rock, and we have no significance. This fundamental conspiracy against the meaning of man. And I think this applies across many dimensions. Because unless we start to go back into our own memory and start to really think about the astral plane of existence, let's say, the astral consciousness, the multidimensional consciousness of what we're doing here. start to remember? Are we here because we got enslaved somehow? Did we get caught up into some kind of debt slavery on a soul level, right, that brought us here? How much of that then did we choose? Did we choose to come here? Did we choose to co-create this reality? We are born, we're supposed to be born free on this planet. And going back to, was it Rousseau, like man is born free and everywhere he's in chains? It's like we've imprisoned ourselves. So I think the great conspiracy is just the fact that we really don't know who we are. We are brainwashed from the point of elementary school forward by socialization. We are brainwashed, by our television, on movies, and sort of the reality that's put forth for us, and never yet told, look within. Think about the deeper essence of reality, the deeper meaning of why you're here. Unless you ask that question, why am I here? What is my purpose? Then you're lost in life. So I think the great conspiracy is the focus, in that sense, the focus on a material, random tradition, let's say, right, of human evolution, of the randomness of existence, the entropic nature of reality, that we're all just destined for death anyway. This universe, it freaks you out as a kid. People tell you, the sun is going to stop, shining one day, and the universe is going to come to an end, and it's going to end in heat, and either a heat death or a cooling. But either way, the universe is expanding, and at some point, it's going to basically, the lights are all going to go out. Right? There's an end. And that mentality is very scary. So that all plays into, again, the materialist reptilian brain that's predicated in scarcity, that believes because things are scarce and resources are scarce, I have to fight to survive. I have to, claim what's mine. I have to I have to basically try to seize and control, as opposed to flowing and being existent and being one with existence. Let's say in unity with the environment around me, with not even just like from the point of view of don't litter, but just from the point of view of we are all made from the same stuff. We are made from the same components as the soil and the trees. It's like it's all very it sounds all very like hippie, but actually that's the nature of this reality. It's infinite, so we need to stop thinking in limited resource scarcity ways and start thinking about the infinite nature of mind. And the more we master it and come to terms with that, I think that we can expose and ultimately eviscerate the dark forces that are playing these damn shows, like Plato's Cave, right? They're playing all these shadows on the wall, and we're watching the shadows, mesmerized, excited, fearful, but never realizing that it's all just a show. There is no reality to it.
Yeah, I second that motion. I think it is very important for us to look into where we came from and what our purpose is, and that all leads to self-awareness. And I believe in there's that global consciousness. Now we are running close on time. We got a little over 3 minutes left, so I wanted to start asking you, what can people expect to see from you at the Conscious Life Expo?
I don't know. I really don't know. I'm honestly just going to be there. And, I hope there's a good turnout of people because, I always enjoy Q&A and I enjoy discussions. I don't really like presentations when I don't have if I don't have a film or something to present. I'm not here as a researcher. I'm just simply going as a human being that's looking to engage with others, and hopefully, we'll stimulate some interesting conversation.
You're doing something with Dean Ryan. Am I not mistaken?
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about that? What he's doing?
Again, I really don't know. Again, that's I basically came because Dean asked me to, and I felt like it would be a good expo to sort of come and engage and just find people on similar wavelength. But no, my presentation will simply be a Q&A for anyone who wants to talk.
Well, you'll definitely have a lot of them there, and you'll find you'll find that most of the people there you can relate to. Between 10 to 12,000 people will come through those doors over those 3 days, and it'll be an amazing event. Just a couple more questions. What was the one? Obviously we talked about several little points in your life, but what was the one turning point that you can label that you basically woke up your inner self? Was there one day that something happened that occurred, or was it just...
yeah. I mean, I think that's happened many times in life, but I would say the most recent that I could point to and actually, made a movie about it was when I broke into, this haunted mental hospital called Greystone in New Jersey, because the engagement, suddenly encountering many of these energies and forces that you can read about, and you can kind of, you can as an historian, you can study magic and witchcraft and sorcery and demons and whatnot. But when you actually start to open the doors and physically feel it, experience paranormal things, supernatural things, everything changes. So that's why I made Greystone Park as a feature film, because of that experience that I went through, and I tried to kind of embody that, encapsulate it, my personal subjective experience into a film. So I would say that night that I first broke in and started ghost hunting and started confronting the other realm, the other side, that would be a definite turning point that I can put my finger at.
Obviously, everybody, I hope you truly enjoyed. This is the one and only Sean Stone. I do have one final question for you. What is next for you? What can people expect to hear about you or from you in the next year, 5 years, and decade? What are your plans?
Well, honestly, I'm not going to broadcast anything, because that's all, I think that's left between my own psyche and God. But, I think, people obviously will see what comes. And, when it's ready, whenever something is ready to come out, then, we'll be on the road talking about it.
Do you have any websites or anything you could
No, I mean,
point towards?
Our show, as you mentioned, Buzzsaw, is online, thelip.tv/Buzzsaw. I mean, it's on YouTube, so it's easy to find. And then my Facebook page, I have a fan page on Facebook. That's usually the best way to contact me.
Wasn't that an amazing interview with both Sean Stone, Hour 2, and, of course, Eric Von Däniken, Hour 1? Johnny, what did you think?
Well, I thought they were both very, very interesting. I wish I'd had more opportunity to put questions to them, but when they're on a roll, they're on a roll. And, it's very difficult to do that. But, what do I think? I think that the people that are coming on this show are speaking their mind, just like Sean, the last guest there. He spoke his mind, he's open-hearted, he's awake, he's spiritually awake. He's not giving anything away because he's still exploring, So as far as I can see with Sean, he's going to be an interesting man to watch in the future. But Eric Von Däniken, I've always loved what he says. I've followed him for many years, and I feel that what he offered here this evening is another insight into the glorious understandings of what's going on. What do you think, Johnny boy?
You took the words out of my mind. Sean Stone is definitely someone people need to pay attention to. A few years ago, you didn't even know that name unless you watched Conspiracy Theory. Years before that, he was non-existent unless you went to Princeton and met him there, or through wherever he went to high school. Now he was really making a big name for himself, both with Buzzsaw, speaking at Conscious Life Expo, and so much more. And then going back to Eric Von Däniken, he is the father of the ancient astronaut theory. He is the person that first postulated before Zecharia Sitchin that we were visited. Again, this was such an amazing interview. There is going to be so much more from Sean to come. Everybody out there listening, believe us, they will both be back. As a matter of fact, Eric Von Däniken just confirmed that he will be back right here on our show in end of May. And let's just tell everybody else who else is going to be coming on soon. Of course, the godfather of ufology, Stanton Friedman, someone who is a very dear friend to both me and Johnny Webb, and that is the Honorable Paul Hellyer, former Defense Minister of Canada. Also, someone else on ancient astronaut theories and ancient petroglyphs and other things, Michael Tellinger, as well as Grant Cameron will be joining us yet again. So many more, including Betty Andreasen, which is her maiden name. She is now Betty Luca. Her and her husband, Bob, will be joining us and speaking about the Andreasen affair. So much more. Everybody can see the calendar at Dr. J Radio Live. Again, drjradiolive.com. Follow us at Twitter at Dr. J Radio Live. Also, Instagram, Dr. J Radio Live. Same thing, Facebook, Instagram, Tumblr, Flickr, all the media accounts are all under one name, DRJ Radio Live, as well as the YouTube. And again, this is your station, people. This is the show that is for what you want to hear. The requests that we have, and we take them seriously and we put them on because you, the people, ask for them. So with that being said, reach out to us anytime you want, and we will go from there. Again, this is Dr. J and my co-host Johnny Webb, and we are signing out of Rome Radio. Have a good night.